The elevator that changed everything. It was just another regular Monday morning when I found myself heading toward the elevator of the towering corporate building where I worked. The sun had barely risen, casting long golden streaks over the city skyline, but inside the office, the air was already filled with the distant hum of machines, the clatter of keyboards, and the murmured conversations of employees settling into another long work week. My name is Cameron, and to put it simply, I was just another cog in the massive corporate machine. A worker bee in a hive that thrived on efficiency, productivity, and relentless ambition. The Office of Dynamic Innovations, a leading tech company, wasn't a bad place to work, but it wasn't exactly inspiring either. I had dreams of something bigger, something greater, but no clear idea of how to get there. As I walked into the lobby, adjusting my tie and gripping my coffee cup a little too tightly, I pressed the elevator button, preparing myself for another uneventful day filled with spreadsheets, reports, and meetings that could have easily been emails. What I wasn't prepared for, however, was the encounter that would change my life forever. Meeting Emily, the woman at the top. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and as I stepped in, I immediately realized I wasn't alone. Standing inside was none other than Emily Carter, my boss, my superior, and one of the most influential women in the entire company. Emily was everything you'd expect from a woman who had reached the pinnacle of corporate success. In her mid-30s, she carried herself with an air of confidence and authority that commanded respect. Her sharp features, piercing blue eyes, and tailored business attire made her look like she had stepped straight out of a magazine cover. She was the kind of woman who seemed untouchable, always composed, always in control, and never flustered. Every employee knew her name, and every higher-up respected her decisions. I had admired her from a distance, but to her, I was just another nameless employee lost in the sea of workers. Emily glanced up from her phone, her expression neutral. "Morning," she said, her voice smooth yet firm. I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Morning, Ms. Carter." The doors closed, and the elevator began its steady ascent. The air inside felt heavy, not from discomfort, but from an unspoken weight that seemed to linger between us. I wasn't used to being in such close quarters with someone of her stature. Then, just as we passed the 10th floor, the elevator lurched violently, jerking to a sudden halt. The lights flickered. The quiet hum of the machinery stopped. And then there was silence, trapped together. For a moment, neither of us spoke. My heart pounded as I pressed the button for the emergency call, but there was no immediate response. "Great," I muttered under my breath. Emily sighed and crossed her arms. "Of course, this would happen today," she said, shaking her head. I hesitated before glancing at her. Does this happen often?" She exhaled, running a hand through her dark brown hair. "Not really. But with how outdated this building is, I can't say I'm surprised." There was a slight edge to her voice, not panic, but frustration. She pressed a few buttons on the control panel, but nothing happened. The realization slowly sank in. We were stuck. I rubbed the back of my neck. "Well, I guess we're in for a bit of a wait." Emily leaned against the elevator wall, checking her watch. "I have a board meeting in an hour." I raised an eyebrow. Pretty sure being trapped in an elevator is a good excuse for being late. She gave me a small, almost amused glance before shaking her head. "Not in my world. In my world, lateness is weakness." I frowned, sensing something deeper beneath her words. She seemed tense, not just because of the situation, but because she genuinely hated the idea of being out of control. For the first time, I saw a glimpse of something beyond the polished, untouchable CEO image she projected. There was something more, something almost human. Breaking the silence. Minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity. The silence in the small, enclosed space became almost suffocating. "So," I said, trying to break the awkward quiet, "since we're going to be stuck here for a while, mind if I ask you a question?" Emily raised an eyebrow, but nodded slightly. Go ahead. I hesitated. What's it like? Being at the top. She studied me for a moment, then let out a soft chuckle. You want the truth. I nodded. She sighed. It's exhausting. That caught me off guard. Really? I've worked my whole life to get here, she admitted, her voice quieter now. I have the power, the respect, the success. But sometimes it feels like I've sacrificed too much. She looked away, almost as if she hadn't meant to say that aloud. I leaned against the opposite wall, folding my arms. What do you mean? Emily exhaled slowly. When I was younger, I thought this was everything I wanted. The power, the status, the ability to make a difference. But the higher you climb, the more alone you become. I hadn't expected that kind of honesty. I've had relationships, she continued, her voice laced with something I couldn't quite place. But they never last. People only see me for my title. My career is my life. But sometimes, I wonder if I've missed out on something more important. I blinked. This was Emily Carter, one of the most powerful women in the industry, admitting that she felt empty. I wasn't sure what to say, but something inside me told me to be honest. I think you deserve more, I said. You deserve something real. Someone who sees you, not just the title. Her eyes met mine then, something unreadable flickering in them. For a moment, I thought she was going to say something, but then the elevator suddenly groaned, and with a mechanical whir, the lights flickered back to life. The doors slid open. We were free. An unspoken change. For a brief second, neither of us moved. It was as if the moment between us hadn't quite ended yet. Then Emily straightened, her professional mask slipping back into place. Well, that was an interesting way to start the day. I forced a chuckle. Yeah, definitely not how I planned my Monday morning. She stepped out of the elevator first, turning back slightly. See you around, Cameron. Then she was gone, disappearing into the bustling office like nothing had happened. But I knew. Something had changed. I wasn't sure what it was yet, but I could feel it in my gut. That moment in the elevator wasn't just a passing encounter. It was the beginning of something bigger, something neither of us could ignore. And I had no idea what was coming next. A shift in the air. The days following my unexpected elevator encounter with Emily Carter were anything but normal. It wasn't that anything dramatic had happened, no grand declarations, no immediate fallout, but something had shifted, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. At first, I convinced myself that it was nothing. After all, she was my boss, and I was just another employee. But no matter how much I tried to push the thought aside, I couldn't forget the way she had looked at me, the way she had spoken. It wasn't the confident, polished CEO talking to a subordinate. It was Emily, the woman behind the title, admitting for the first time, at least to me, that she felt trapped. That admission stuck with me. And as the days stretched on, I started noticing the way she looked at me too. The office feels different. Monday morning, I walked into the office as usual, clutching my coffee, trying to shake off the feeling of restlessness that had followed me all weekend. The place was buzzing. As always, phones ringing, keyboards clacking, conversations drifting in and out of focus. I nodded to a few coworkers as I made my way to my desk, trying to settle back into my usual routine. But then, as I passed by the executive wing, my gaze unintentionally drifted toward Emily's office. And that's when it happened. For the briefest moment, our eyes met. She had been standing near the window, speaking to someone on the phone. But as if sensing me, she turned. Her blue eyes locked onto mine. It was only a second, maybe less, but in that fleeting moment, there was something, an unspoken acknowledgement, a recognition of what had passed between us in that elevator. Then she looked away, continuing her conversation like nothing had happened. I swallowed hard and forced myself to keep walking, but my heart was pounding. Was I imagining it? An unexpected invitation. A few hours later, I was knee-deep in work, staring at my computer screen, when my inbox chimed with a new email. I clicked it open, expecting another routine task. But then I saw the sender's name. Emily Carter. Subject: meeting request, 3 p.m. I felt a strange jolt in my chest. Emily didn't usually email me directly. Any communication I had with her was filtered through my department heads. So why now? I hesitated for a moment, then typed a quick response. Understood. I'll be there. As I hit send, I tried to ignore the uneasy excitement creeping into my veins. The meeting that wasn't just a meeting. By the time 3 p.m. rolled around, I had convinced myself that I was overthinking things. Emily was the CEO. She made decisions, assigned work, and held meetings all the time. There was no reason to assume this was anything more than just that, a meeting. But the moment I stepped into her office, I knew I was wrong. Emily was sitting at her desk, looking out the floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the city. She didn't turn when I entered. Instead, she simply said, "Close the door." Something about her tone made my stomach tighten. I obeyed, feeling the weight of the silence between us. Finally, she turned to face me. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something in her eyes that I hadn't seen before, a flicker of uncertainty, or something deeper. "Have a seat, Cameron," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. I sat, my palms slightly sweaty. She studied me for a moment, then exhaled. "I wanted to talk to you about something, off the record." Off the record. That was new. I leaned forward slightly, intrigued. "Okay." Emily tapped her fingers on the desk, as if choosing her words carefully. "That conversation we had in the elevator," she began slowly. "I've been thinking about it a lot." My breath hitched. So I hadn't imagined it. She continued, "It's rare for me to open up to anyone, especially someone in my company. But you," she hesitated, "you made me think about things I haven't allowed myself to think about in a long time." I wasn't sure what to say. Emily sighed and leaned back in her chair. "You asked me what it's like at the top. And I told you it's exhausting. That's the truth. But there's more to it than that." She looked at me then, her gaze unwavering. "The truth is, Cameron, I feel trapped." I swallowed hard. Trapped how? Emily glanced out the window. "Like I'm stuck in a machine I built myself. I spent years climbing to this position, proving myself, making sacrifices. And now that I'm here, I don't know if I want it anymore." I stared at her. Emily Carter, the woman who had built an empire, the woman everyone admired, the woman who never faltered, was telling me that she wasn't happy. It was surreal. And yet, I understood her more than I wanted to admit. I cleared my throat. "So, what are you going to do?" Emily exhaled, rubbing her temple. "I don't know. That's the problem." There was a long silence. Then she looked at me again, and for the first time, I saw something raw in her expression. Vulnerability. "I need someone I can trust, Cameron," she admitted quietly. "And for some reason, I feel like that person might be you." My heart pounded so hard I was sure she could hear it. I wasn't sure how to respond, but I knew one thing. This was more than just a conversation between a boss and an employee. This was something else. Something dangerous. Something that neither of us were ready to name. A decision that changes everything. By the time I left her office, I felt like my entire world had been flipped upside down. Emily had just given me a glimpse of something I was never supposed to see, the human side of her, the part that was tired, lonely, and searching for something more. And the worst part, I wanted to be that something more. But could I? She was my boss. Getting involved with her, on any level, was risky. A bad idea. And yet, as I made my way back to my desk, I realized something else. It was already too late. Because in that moment, I knew, deep down, I was already falling for her, and there was no turning back. Lines that blur. I barely slept that night. I tossed and turned, my mind replaying my conversation with Emily over and over again like a song stuck on repeat. She trusted me. She had said it outright. And not just as an employee. It was personal. That single word had shaken my world more than I wanted to admit. It was one thing to admire her from a distance, to respect her as a powerful leader. But now, knowing she saw me as someone she could open up to, someone she could confide in, was a different kind of weight altogether. And it terrified me. Because it meant that the line between boss and employee, the line that should never be crossed, was starting to blur. A change in atmosphere. The next morning, I walked into the office determined to act normal, to go about my day as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. I could feel it in the air. Maybe I was just being paranoid, but when I walked past my coworkers, I couldn't shake the feeling that they knew something, that they could see it on me, the restlessness, the anticipation, the way my pulse quickened every time I caught a glimpse of Emily's office. She was there when I arrived, already busy as usual, her door slightly ajar. For a moment, I debated whether I should pretend like our conversation never happened, or if I should acknowledge it in some way. Then, as if she had sensed me standing there, she glanced up. Our eyes met again. It was quick, subtle, but it was enough. And in that split second, I realized that I wasn't the only one who had spent the night thinking about what happened. Emily had too. The business dinner. The day passed in a blur of meetings, emails, and reports, but my mind wasn't fully in it. By the time the clock hit 5 p.m., I was exhausted, not from work, but from the mental tug-of-war I had been playing with myself all day. I needed a distraction. Just as I was about to pack up and leave, my phone buzzed with a new email. I frowned. It was from Emily. Subject: business dinner, tonight, 8 p.m. Cameron, join me for dinner tonight. It's a client meeting, but I want you there. It'll be good exposure for you. Emily. I stared at the screen, my fingers tightening around my phone. A business dinner. That's all it was. Right? I typed out a quick response. Understood. See you there. And just like that, my plans for the evening had changed. An evening that felt too personal. The restaurant Emily chose was one of the city's most expensive, one of those places where the lighting was dim, the wine was overpriced, and the tables were spaced far enough apart to ensure privacy for high-profile guests. I arrived 5 minutes early, adjusting my tie as I stepped inside. The host greeted me with a polite nod before leading me to a private section of the restaurant. Emily was already there, seated at a corner table, a glass of red wine in front of her. She looked different. She wasn't in her usual corporate power suit. Instead, she wore a dark navy dress that hugged her figure in a way that made it impossible to ignore. Her hair was styled slightly softer, loose waves cascading down her shoulders. For a moment, I just stood there, caught off guard by the sheer presence of her. Then she looked up and smiled. Cameron, she greeted, gesturing to the seat across from her. Right on time. I cleared my throat and sat down, trying to suppress the rush of warmth spreading through my chest. This is a business dinner, right? I asked, keeping my voice even. Her lips curled slightly. Yes, but I wanted you here for more than just business. I tensed. What do you mean? She took a sip of her wine before meeting my gaze. You're being considered for a leadership position in the company. More responsibility, bigger projects. I blinked. I didn't know that. She nodded. That's why I wanted you here tonight, to see how you handle situations outside of the office. I exhaled, my nerves calming slightly. This is professional. Before I could respond, a well-dressed older man approached our table with a confident stride. Emily. He greeted with a charming smile. It's been too long. She stood, shaking his hand. It has. Thank you for making time tonight. I rose as well, offering my hand. And you must be Cameron, the man said, shaking my hand firmly. Emily's told me a lot about you. I stiffened. She has. Emily smirked slightly but said nothing. The dinner that followed was a blur of discussions about business strategy, upcoming mergers, and corporate partnerships. I listened, absorbing everything, speaking when necessary, and keeping my focus sharp. But no matter how much I tried to remain professional, I couldn't ignore the way Emily kept glancing at me when she thought I wasn't looking, or the way her knee accidentally brushed against mine beneath the table, or the way my pulse raced every time she said my name. By the time the dinner ended, I felt like I had just run a marathon, mentally and emotionally. As we stepped outside, the cool night air hitting my face, I finally let out a breath. "That went well," I said. Emily nodded. It did. A beat of silence passed. Then, before I could stop myself, I said, "Did you really tell them a lot about me?" Emily turned to me, her gaze unreadable. "Yes." I swallowed. "Why?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took a step closer, her eyes searching mine. "You already know why, Cameron." My breath hitched. She was too close. Too dangerous. Too tempting. I should have stepped back. I should have reminded myself that she was my boss. But I didn't. Instead, I stood there, locked in a moment that felt like it could change everything. Then, before anything could happen, Emily took a step back and exhaled. "Good night, Cameron," she said softly. And just like that, she was gone, leaving me standing there, heart pounding, realizing that I was in far too deep. The breaking point. I couldn't shake it. The moment outside the restaurant played in my head like a loop I couldn't turn off. The way Emily had looked at me. The tension in the air so thick it felt suffocating. The way she had said, "You already know why," like it was the simplest thing in the world. But it wasn't simple. Nothing about this was simple. She was my boss. I worked for her. She had just hinted at giving me a promotion. That alone should have been enough to keep my emotions in check, to remind myself that crossing any line with her would be a disaster waiting to happen. And yet, I couldn't stop thinking about her. It was dangerous. It was reckless. But it was real. A tense office. I came into work the next morning feeling like I was walking on a tightrope. Everything in the office looked the same. The coffee machine still hummed. The printer still beeped, and people still walked around with tired faces and endless to-do lists. But for me, everything felt different. Because I knew that at the end of the hallway, inside the glass-walled office with the city skyline view, she was there. Emily Carter, my boss. The woman who had shaken my entire world without even realizing it. I took a deep breath and made my way to my desk. I had barely sat down when an email notification popped up. Subject: my office. Now, I didn't need to check the sender. I knew who it was. Behind closed doors. When I stepped into Emily's office, she was sitting behind her desk, typing something on her laptop. The second she saw me, she closed the screen and gestured toward the chair across from her. "Close the door," she said. I hesitated for only a second before I did as she asked. As soon as the door shut, the tension thickened. I sat down, trying to keep my expression neutral, but it was impossible, because she was staring at me. Not like a boss, not like a superior giving orders, but like a woman who was trying to figure out how much further she could push something that she shouldn't even be considering. "About last night," she started. I tensed. "Yeah?" She exhaled, rubbing her temple. That moment outside the restaurant. I swallowed hard. "I remember. I shouldn't have said what I said," she admitted. "I shouldn't have." She trailed off, shaking her head. "This isn't professional." I nodded slowly. "I know." We sat in silence for a moment. Then she leaned forward, her elbows resting on her desk. "But here's the problem, Cameron." I waited, my heart pounding. "I don't regret it," she said softly. "And I don't think you do either." My breath hitched. No, I didn't regret it. I had spent the entire night replaying that moment in my head, wondering what would have happened if she hadn't stepped back, if I hadn't hesitated, If we had crossed that unspoken line. Emily studied my face, her expression unreadable. Tell me I'm wrong. I opened my mouth. I should have said it. I should have said, you're wrong. This is a mistake. We should pretend this never happened. But I didn't. Because it wasn't a mistake. And we both knew it. Instead, I said, where do we go from here? Emily leaned back in her chair, looking up at the ceiling as if searching for an answer she didn't have. I don't know, she admitted. But I do know one thing. What? She met my eyes again. I don't want to pretend anymore. The risk we took. The weeks that followed were a blur of stolen glances, hushed conversations, and unspoken words that hung between us like a fragile thread. We didn't acknowledge it outright. Not in front of others, not in emails, not in meetings. But when we were alone, everything changed. It was in the way she lingered just a little too long when handing me paperwork. The way my name sounded different when she said it in private. The way we both seemed to exist in our own unspoken world when we were together. One evening, after another long day, Emily called me into her office just as everyone else was packing up to leave. I stepped inside, shutting the door behind me. You wanted to see me. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she just looked at me, her expression unreadable. Then, without warning, she stood and walked around her desk until she was standing just inches away from me. I can't keep doing this, she murmured. My stomach tightened. Doing what? Emily let out a quiet, almost frustrated laugh. Acting like I don't want you. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. For a second, I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then finally, I whispered, then stopped pretending. And that was it. The moment everything changed. The moment I stopped thinking and just felt. The next thing I knew, her hands were in my hair, and my lips were on hers. And every rule, every line, every damn consequence vanished in an instant. It was reckless. It was dangerous. But it was real. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of what came next. The consequences. The problem with crossing a line is that once you do, you can never go back. And we had crossed it. There was no denying it now. The next morning, when I walked into the office, everything looked the same. But we weren't the same. Emily was still my boss. I was still her employee. But now we were something more. Something we couldn't take back. Something we couldn't hide forever. And the scariest part, I wasn't sure if I wanted to. The fire we couldn't contain. The moment our lips met, everything else disappeared. There were no rules, no logic, no second thoughts. Just raw, undeniable need. Emily's fingers curled into my shirt, pulling me closer as I pressed her back against the desk, our breathing uneven, our restraint completely shattered. I knew this was reckless. I knew the consequences. But at that moment, I didn't care. She was the one who had made the first move, the one who had said she didn't want to pretend anymore. And I had been waiting for this longer than I wanted to admit. My hands traced down her waist, feeling the warmth of her body through the thin fabric of her blouse. She let out a soft breath against my lips, and it sent a shiver through me. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, she pulled back. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, her pupils blown wide, her lips slightly parted. I swallowed, trying to steady myself, trying to decipher what she was thinking. Was she regretting it? Was this the moment she realized we had just made the biggest mistake of our lives? But when she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I shouldn't want this. I exhaled slowly, keeping my hands at my sides to stop myself from reaching for her again. But you do. She closed her eyes for a brief second, as if battling something inside herself. Then, with a quiet, almost helpless sigh, she admitted, yes. The word hit me like a drug, intoxicating and dangerous all at once. I had spent weeks, months, seeing her as untouchable, a woman so far out of my reach that even thinking about her this way had felt like a crime. But now she was right in front of me, wanting me back. It should have scared me. Instead, it only made me want her more. Crossing the line. I don't know how long we stood there, staring at each other in silence, the weight of our actions hanging heavy between us. Then Emily shook her head, rubbing her temple like she was trying to make sense of everything. This can't happen here," she murmured, her voice unsteady. "Not like this." I swallowed hard. "Then tell me what you want." Her eyes snapped to mine, searching for something. Maybe hesitation, maybe doubt. But she wouldn't find any. Because for the first time in my life, I knew exactly what I wanted. Her. Emily exhaled shakily, looking toward the closed door of her office as if expecting someone to barge in at any second. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she made a decision. "Meet me outside in an hour," she said quietly. "Not here. Not where anyone can see us." My pulse skyrocketed. "Where?" She hesitated. Then she grabbed a pen and scribbled something on a notepad before tearing off the piece of paper and handing it to me. I glanced down. It was an address. "Come if you want," she said, her voice softer now. "But if you do, we don't turn back." She was giving me an out. A chance to walk away before things spiraled even further. Before we set fire to everything we had built. I looked back at her. And then, without a second thought, I folded the paper and slipped it into my pocket. "I'll be there." The hotel room. An hour later, I stood outside the hotel Emily had written down. It was one of those luxury places downtown, the kind with a marble lobby and soft golden lighting that made everything feel a little too intimate. I wasn't sure what I expected when I arrived, but when I walked inside, the receptionist barely glanced at me before nodding toward the elevator. "She's already upstairs. Room 1408. My stomach twisted. She had already booked a room. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. This wasn't an accident. Emily had planned this. That thought alone sent a rush of heat through me. As I stepped into the elevator, my hands clenched at my sides, my mind racing. I wasn't nervous about what would happen next. I was nervous about what it meant. Because once I walked through that door, everything between us would change forever. The elevator dinged, and I stepped out onto the 14th floor. The hallway was quiet, the soft carpet muffling my footsteps as I walked toward the room. I stopped in front of 1408, my heart pounding. For a brief second, I considered turning around, walking away, pretending this night never happened. But then I lifted my hand and knocked. The door opened almost instantly. And there she was. Emily stood in the doorway, her heels off, her hair slightly tousled, wearing a simple satin robe that clung to her frame in a way that made it impossible to think about anything else. She didn't say anything. She just stepped aside, silently inviting me in. I walked past her, feeling the warmth of the room wrap around me. The faint scent of her perfume lingered in the air, mixing with something heavier, something electric. The door clicked shut behind me. And in that moment I knew. There was no turning back. The aftermath. I woke up to the soft glow of morning light filtering through the hotel room's curtains. For a few seconds, I forgot where I was. Then I felt the warmth beside me. Emily. Her bare shoulder peeked out from the tangled sheets, her dark hair spilling over the pillow, her breathing slow and steady. She looked so different like this. So unshielded. So human. I swallowed, staring at the ceiling, reality slowly creeping back in. This was real. This happened. And now, there was no way to pretend otherwise. I shifted slightly, causing her to stir. She blinked a few times before turning her head to look at me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, with a small, tired smile, she murmured, "Morning." I exhaled. Morning. A beat of silence passed. Then she reached for my hand beneath the sheets, intertwining our fingers. "Are you regretting this?" she asked quietly. I squeezed her hand gently. No. Her shoulders relaxed slightly. But I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. What happens now? Emily sighed, rolling onto her back, staring at the ceiling. I don't know. I watched her for a moment. Then, finally, I said what had been on my mind since the moment this all started. I don't want to be your secret. Emily turned her head to face me, her expression unreadable. That's not going to be easy, she admitted. I nodded. I know. She exhaled slowly. Then let's take it one step at a time. It wasn't an answer, but it was something. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know if we were making the biggest mistake of our lives. But as I lay there beside her, my fingers still laced with hers, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't walking away. No matter what came next, I was in this, for better or worse. When the world starts noticing. For the next few weeks, Emily and I lived in a delicate, dangerous balance. What had started as something undeniable in the shadows of a hotel room had now become a quiet, unspoken truth between us. We were careful. At work, we kept things professional. Our conversations were precise, our glances fleeting, our body language neutral. To the outside world, nothing had changed. But behind closed doors, everything had. Every night, every moment we stole away from the rigid structure of the corporate world, we unraveled a little more of each other. It wasn't just about the physical connection, though that was intoxicating in itself. It was the stolen conversations at midnight, the way she let her guard down when she was with me, the way she told me things I knew she had never told anyone else. And for me, it was the way she looked at me like I was someone, not just another name on her payroll. But no matter how careful we were, no matter how much we told ourselves we could keep this under control, the world had a way of noticing things we didn't want it to see. The first suspicion. It started subtly. A raised eyebrow from a colleague when Emily and I left the same meeting at the same time. A glance from a receptionist when she saw us exchanging a look that lingered just a second too long. I ignored it. We were professionals. We weren't reckless. But then, one morning, I walked into the break room, only to find my coworker, James, smirking at me over his coffee cup. What? I asked, grabbing my own cup and trying to act casual. James shrugged, his smirk widening. Nothing, man. Just, interesting how Carter's been calling you into her office a lot lately. I froze for just a second before forcing a chuckle. It's work. I got promoted, remember? Aha. He took a sip of his coffee, eyeing me over the rim. Sure. Just work. I rolled my eyes. You're reading too much into it. Maybe. He leaned against the counter, lowering his voice. But you know how this place is. People talk. And let's just say, a lot of people are wondering why the boss seems to have a special interest in you. I kept my expression neutral, but my grip on the coffee cup tightened. People were noticing. And that was dangerous. Emily's warning. That afternoon, I found myself in Emily's office again, the blinds half closed, the door locked. It was the only time we ever allowed ourselves the luxury of being alone together during work hours. She was sitting at her desk, her fingers resting against her temple as she scanned through an email. I heard something today, I said, breaking the silence. She glanced up, immediately catching the tension in my voice. What is it? I hesitated before exhaling. People are talking. About us. Emily's expression didn't change, but I saw the flicker of concern behind her eyes. What exactly are they saying? She asked. I shook my head. Nothing direct. Just suspicions, wondering why you're spending so much time with me. She sighed, rubbing the bridge of her nose. I knew this would happen eventually. I frowned. You don't seem surprised. I'm not. She leaned back in her chair, watching me carefully. Cameron, I've been in this industry long enough to know how fast rumors spread. And I knew from the moment we started this, that it wouldn't stay hidden forever. I swallowed. So what do we do? Emily was silent for a moment. Then she said, we stay careful. We act normal. And we don't give them a reason to confirm their suspicions. I nodded, but something in her voice made my stomach tighten. Because even though she was saying we needed to be careful, I could see it in her eyes. She didn't want to hide either. An unplanned encounter. We had been doing well. For weeks, we maintained our distance in the office, made sure to leave separately if we ever met after hours, and kept our personal connection locked away behind closed doors. But no matter how hard we tried to stay in control, there were things we couldn't plan for, like running into each other outside of work. It happened on a Saturday. I had gone to a small cafe downtown to grab a coffee and catch up on some work. It was a quiet place, far from the corporate scene, and I had never run into anyone from the office there before. So when I saw Emily standing in line, staring down at her phone, my heart nearly stopped. She hadn't noticed me yet. She was dressed casually, no power suit, no heels, just a fitted sweater and jeans. And yet, she still looked effortlessly in control. For a moment, I debated whether I should pretend I hadn't seen her. But then, as if sensing me, she looked up. And our eyes met. A flicker of surprise crossed her face before she quickly masked it. I walked over, keeping my voice low. "Fancy meeting you here." Emily arched an eyebrow. I could say the same. The line moved forward, and she stepped up to the counter to place her order. I followed, ordering my usual. As we waited, she glanced at me. "Are you here alone?" I nodded. "Yeah. You?" She hesitated, then nodded as well. A beat of silence passed before she murmured, "Walk with me." I should have said no. I should have told her that being seen together outside of work was a bad idea. But I didn't. Because the truth was, I wanted to walk with her. So I nodded. And that was the second mistake we made. The picture that changed everything. We didn't go far, just a few blocks, strolling past the bookstore-lined streets, the conversation light, the tension heavy. It felt normal. For the first time, we weren't hiding behind office walls or stolen hotel rooms. We were just us. But normal didn't last. The next day, I received a text from James. "Dude, you and Carter were seen together downtown yesterday." My stomach dropped. I quickly typed back, "What? By who?" A few seconds later, he sent an image. A blurry photo of me and Emily walking together, our heads slightly tilted toward each other, mid-conversation. Nothing incriminating. Nothing obvious. But still, enough. Enough to start rumors. Enough to plant doubt. Enough to ruin everything. And as I stared at the picture, my pulse racing, I realized something. We weren't just playing with fire anymore. We were standing in the middle of an inferno. And sooner or later, we were going to get burned. The fire that burned us both. I stared at the picture on my phone for a long time, my pulse hammering in my ears. It wasn't damning. Not in the way it could have been. But it was enough. Enough to start whispers. Enough to put doubt into people's minds. Enough to make me realize that no matter how careful we were, the world around us was beginning to close in. I had known this would happen eventually. I just hadn't expected it to happen so soon. The confrontation. Monday morning. I walked into the office with my heart pounding, my jaw tight. I wasn't sure what I was expecting. Maybe hushed voices, stolen glances, the weight of judgment hanging in the air. But everything looked normal. People worked. Phones rang. Papers shuffled. And yet, I felt the shift. Then, as I passed the conference rooms, a familiar voice called my name. "Cameron." I turned. Emily stood near her office, her expression unreadable. "Come inside," she said. The door shut behind me with a quiet click, sealing us away from the rest of the world. Emily crossed her arms, looking at me with an intensity that made my stomach tighten. I saw the picture. I swallowed hard. "I figured you did." Her lips pressed into a thin line. And I exhaled, running a hand through my hair. "We were careful, Emily. We are careful. But people notice things." Her gaze didn't waver. "It only takes one rumor to ruin everything, Cameron. one whisper in the wrong ear, and suddenly I'm being questioned about my professional integrity. I clenched my fists. You think I don't know that? Silence stretched between us. Then she sighed, pacing toward the window, looking out at the city below. We need to be smarter. I swallowed the lump in my throat. Or, she turned back to me. I hesitated. Then, quietly, I said, or we stop this. The words felt like acid in my mouth, but I forced them out anyway. Emily's face remained composed, but I saw the flicker of something in her eyes. Pain, maybe. Or maybe it was the same thing I felt. The quiet devastation of knowing we were standing on borrowed time. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. Then, slowly, she walked up to me, her voice lower now. Is that what you want? I didn't answer. Because it wasn't about what I wanted. It was about what we had to do. Cameron, she whispered, I can handle this. I let out a hollow laugh. You can't control everything, Emily. Not this. Her jaw tightened. Then what do you suggest? That we throw it all away? I exhaled sharply, taking a step closer, close enough that I could see the small, almost imperceptible crack in her composure. I don't want to stop this, I admitted. But what happens when someone takes that picture to HR? When the board starts questioning you? When? I'll handle it, she repeated. The stubbornness in her voice made my chest ache. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to trust that we could walk through this fire and come out unscathed. But deep down, I knew better. And so did she. The breaking point. For the next few weeks, we continued as if nothing had changed. On the surface, we were professionals. Our interactions in the office remained composed, controlled. But behind closed doors, it was different. We held on to each other like we were running out of time. Like we knew this was slipping through our fingers. But we weren't ready to let go yet. The nights were longer. The kisses more desperate. Because we both knew the truth neither of us wanted to say. This wasn't sustainable. And sooner or later, something had to break. And it did. One evening, after another long day, Emily called me to her office. Her voice had been calm. But when I walked inside, I felt it. The shift, the change. She stood behind her desk, arms crossed, expression carefully blank. I closed the door. What's going on? She was silent for a long moment. Then, finally, she exhaled. They know. My stomach dropped. Who? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Emily looked at me, her eyes colder than I had ever seen them. The board. I stiffened. How? She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. Rumors. Whispers. That damn picture. Doesn't matter. The point is they know. A heavy silence settled between us. Then she said the words I had been dreading. They gave me a choice, Cameron. I swallowed. What kind of choice? She met my gaze, her voice quieter now. I stepped down, or you leave. The words were a gunshot to the chest. I felt winded, like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. My voice caught. They can't do that. They can, she murmured. And they have. I stared at her, my pulse roaring in my ears. So what happens now? She looked away. And I knew. I knew. She had made her choice. She had already decided. The realization hit me like a brick wall, knocking the breath out of me. I took a step back, the weight of it settling in my chest. You're keeping your position. Emily didn't answer. Because she didn't have to. I let out a quiet, humorless laugh. Of course you are. Cameron. I shook my head. No, I get it. You've worked your whole life for this. You can't throw it away. Her lips parted like she wanted to say something, but she didn't. Because she couldn't. Because no matter how much we wanted each other, it wasn't enough. It had never been enough. And maybe, deep down, I had always known that. I turned toward the door. But before I could leave, I felt her fingers wrap around my wrist, stopping me. I closed my eyes, my entire body aching. "Cameron," she whispered. I pulled my arm free before she could finish, because I couldn't hear it. Not now. Not when I knew that the moment I walked out of that office, I wasn't coming back. The end of us. I left the company the next day. No goodbye emails, no explanations, just a resignation letter on my boss's desk. I didn't see Emily again. Not at work, not outside of it. She never called, never texted, and I never reached out, because in the end, we had burned too bright, too fast, too recklessly. And now, all that was left was the ashes. Epilogue. One last glance. Months passed. I moved on, found a new job, built a new life. But some nights, I still thought about her, about the woman who had set my world on fire. Then, one evening, as I was walking through the city, I saw her. She was standing outside a different office building, phone pressed to her ear, eyes sharp, still the same powerhouse she had always been. She didn't see me. Or maybe she did, and just chose to look away. I stood there for a long moment watching her. Then, finally, I turned and walked in the opposite direction. Because no matter how much I had loved her, no matter how much I had wanted it to work, some things weren't meant to last. And Emily Carter and I, we had never stood a chance.